The day my brother stood in that boardroom and told everyone I hadn't held a real job in 7 years, I didn't move. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the window at the far end of the room, where the November sky over downtown Toronto sat heavy and gray, the kind of gray that doesn't apologize for itself. I had known this moment was coming. I had been waiting for it, in a way, for longer than I cared to admit. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is what happened in that room, and what my brother didn't know when he opened his mouth. I grew up in Sudbury, Northern Ontario, in a house that always smelled like wood smoke and my mother's cooking. My father worked the mines. My mother kept the books for 3 small businesses on the main strip: a hardware store, a physiotherapy clinic, and a Portuguese bakery that made the best pão de queijo I've ever tasted. She was quiet and methodical, and she noticed everything. People underestimated her constantly. I think I got that from her. My brother is 4 years older than me. His name is Daniel, and growing up, Daniel was the one everyone talked about. He played hockey at a level that made the whole town proud. He was loud and charming, and he filled every room he walked into. When our father introduced us to his colleagues, he'd say, "This is Daniel, he's going places," and then he'd look at me and say, "And this is my daughter." Just that. No prediction. No pride inflected into the vowels. Just a fact. The way you'd identify furniture. I left Sudbury at 18 to study at the University of Waterloo, computer science, with a minor in applied mathematics. I didn't tell many people at home what I was studying, because the conversations that followed were always the same: eyes glazing over, a polite nod, someone asking if I was going to work at a bank. I learned to keep my professional life quiet early. It wasn't bitterness. It was just efficiency. After Waterloo, I moved to Ottawa. I'll say this plainly. I work for the federal government in a capacity I'm not permitted to describe in detail. What I can say is that my work involves threat analysis, cybersecurity infrastructure, and advising on national-level risk. I have a security clearance that took 14 months to obtain. I have sat in rooms where the decisions made in the next hour would affect things the public wouldn't hear about for a decade, if ever. When people ask me at family dinners what I do, I say I work in government consulting. It's not a lie. It's just a door with most of the hallway hidden behind it. My mother knew more than she let on. Mothers usually do. She passed away 19 months ago, in the spring, after a short and brutal fight with pancreatic cancer. She was 61. She died on a Tuesday morning, with the window open and birds making noise outside, which I think she would have liked. I held her hand. Daniel was not there. He had been delayed, he said, because of a work thing in Calgary. I did not say anything about that at the time. My mother's estate was not enormous, but it was not nothing. The house in Sudbury, fully paid off, was valued at around $410,000. There was a registered retirement savings plan, some non-registered investments, and a joint savings account that she and I had set up together 3 years before she died. Her idea was not mine, to help manage some of her medical costs and daily expenses as her health began to decline. The account had both our names on it. I transferred money into it regularly. I paid for her home care for 8 months. I flew home 11 times in the last 2 years of her life. I did not keep receipts for any of this because it did not occur to me that I would ever need to prove it. That was my mistake, I suppose. Or maybe not. Maybe it was never about the money at all. My mother's will named me as executor. She left the house to be split equally between Daniel and me. The investments went to a small fund she had designated for our 2 cousins in Salt Sweet, Marie, who were still in school. The savings account, which had her name and mine on it, passed directly to me upon her death. That's how joint accounts work in Ontario. There was no ambiguity in the document. Her estate lawyer, a meticulous woman named Margaret, who had known my mother for over a decade, had made sure of that. Daniel hired his own lawyer within 6 weeks of the funeral. He claimed that the money in the joint account, approximately $62,000, had been accumulated through what he called unauthorized transfers from my mother's personal accounts. He claimed I had used my position as her primary caregiver to manipulate her, to move money without her knowledge, and to enrich myself at the expense of the estate. He used the word exploitation. He said it in a letter his lawyer sent to Margaret, and when Margaret forwarded it to me, I sat at my kitchen table in Ottawa and read it 3 times. I was not angry at first. I was something quieter than angry. I was disappointed, maybe, or just tired in a specific way that goes all the way down to the bone. The dispute escalated in the way these things do. Letters became filings. Filings became a formal challenge to the estate. Daniel's lawyer, a man named Clifford Haynes, who operated out of a mid-sized firm in Toronto, was aggressive in the way that lawyers are when their clients have money and momentum, and a story they've convinced themselves is true. He requested documents. He requested my employment records. He requested proof of income. That last request was where things got complicated. I spoke to my own lawyer, a woman named Priya, who I had been referred to by a colleague and who, I would come to understand, was exactly the right person for this situation. I explained what I did for work. I explained the limitations on what I could disclose. Priya listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. And then she said, "Okay, I know who to call. The thing about working where I work is that there are protocols for situations like this. There are people whose job it is to navigate exactly this kind of intersection, where private legal matters bump up against things that can't be discussed in an open proceeding. I won't go into the details of what those protocols involve. What I will say is that Priya made several calls over the following 2 weeks, and that by the time we appeared before the Ontario Superior Court of Justice for the hearing on Daniel's challenge, she had in her possession a document in a sealed envelope that had been delivered by a federal courier. She did not tell me what was in it. She told me to trust her. I did. The hearing was held in a courtroom in downtown Toronto on a Wednesday in late October. The room had high ceilings and that particular institutional quiet that makes every sound feel deliberate. Daniel arrived with Clifford Haynes, and a paralegal and a banker's box of documents. He was wearing a suit I didn't recognize, which told me he'd gone shopping for this. He looked confident in the way people look when they've been rehearsing. He did not look at me when he sat down. The presiding judge was a woman. She was in her late 50s, I thought, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses that she took on and off with the precision of someone who has been doing that for 30 years. She reviewed the initial filings in silence. When she looked up, her face gave nothing away. Clifford Haynes opened by laying out Daniel's position. He was smooth and organized. He described my mother as a vulnerable woman in declining health who had been dependent on me for her daily needs. He described the joint account as a vehicle that I had used to accumulate money that should have formed part of the general estate. He described me, carefully and without saying it directly, as someone who had taken advantage of a dying woman. I sat with my hands flat on the table in front of me. I had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can do in a room where someone is lying about you is to give them nothing to react to. No expression, no movement, just presence. Then Haynes said, "And it should be noted, Your Honor, that the respondent has declined to provide any employment records or verifiable proof of income for the past 7 years, raising significant questions about her financial circumstances and her motivations in inserting herself into her mother's financial affairs." He let that sit in the room for a moment. Daniel, beside him, gave the smallest nod. Priya rose and said, calmly, that she would be addressing the employment question shortly, and that the court's patience on that matter would be rewarded. The judge looked at her for a moment, then nodded. What followed was 2 hours of documentation. Priya walked through the joint account transaction by transaction. She had obtained records showing that the money in the account had not come from my mother's personal savings. It had come from deposits made from my accounts, transferred in to cover her care expenses. She had records from the home care agency, from the pharmacy, from the medical equipment supplier who had provided the hospital-grade bed we had set up in my mother's bedroom in the last 4 months of her life. She had 11 plane tickets, Ottawa to Sudbury, with my name on them. She had a letter from Margaret confirming that my mother had initiated the joint account arrangement herself and had described it to her lawyer as a practical measure to ensure her daughter could manage her care without bureaucratic delays. Haynes pushed back on each point. He was skilled. He suggested the home care could have been paid by the estate funds indirectly. He suggested the account had been opened under pressure. He suggested that a woman with no verifiable employment would have had reason to rely on her mother's financial resources. That word again. Verifiable. Priya let him finish. Then she said, "Your Honor, I'd like to address the matter of my client's employment at this time." She reached into her leather bag and placed the sealed envelope on the table. This document was prepared and transmitted by a federal agency and bears the seal of the Government of Canada. It speaks to my client's employment status and the nature of her work. I'd ask that it be reviewed by Your Honor in camera, given its classification, before any determination is made. The room went still in a particular way. The judge looked at the envelope. She looked at Priya. She looked at me, for just a moment, and I held her gaze without blinking. Then she reached out and picked up the envelope. She took her reading glasses off. She took a small letter opener from the side of her desk. I remember noticing that detail, that she had a letter opener, and she slit the envelope open in one clean motion. She unfolded the document inside. She read it in silence for what felt like a very long time. Once, then again, more slowly. When she looked up, something had shifted in her face. It was not dramatic. It was subtle, the way a room shifts when the light outside changes. She set the document face down on her desk. "Mr. Haynes," she said, "I'm going to ask you to withdraw the line of argument regarding your opposing party's employment history." Haynes blinked. "Your Honor, with respect, the respondent's financial—" "Mr. Haynes." Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room completely. "I've reviewed the document. I'm going to ask you to withdraw that argument. I'll note for the record that the respondent's employment status is not in question." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. I could hear Daniel, beside his lawyer, exhale slowly. Haynes recovered quickly, the way expensive lawyers do, and pivoted back to the transactional arguments. But something had gone out of his posture. The confidence he'd walked in with had a hole in it now, and everyone in that room could feel the draft coming through. The judge was thorough. She asked pointed questions. She asked Haynes to explain specifically which transactions he believed had been improper, and when he identified them, she walked through Priya's documentation methodically, line by line, asking him to indicate where the discrepancy was. Each time he could not find one. The money in the account was mine. The care it had paid for was my mother's. The arrangement had been my mother's idea. Everything was documented. At one point the judge paused and looked at the original account opening forms, which showed my mother's signature and a written note in the margins my mother's handwriting, neat and deliberate, that said, "For my daughter who shows up." I had not seen that note before. I don't think Priya had expected it to land the way it did. I looked at the tabletop and took one slow breath through my nose. The judge dismissed Daniel's challenge in full. She found no evidence of improper transfer, no evidence of undue influence, and no basis for contesting the joint account distribution. She ordered that Daniel's legal costs not be borne by the estate. She made her findings in clear, plain language, without theatrics, and when she was done, she removed her glasses, folded them, and set them on the bench. And she looked across the room with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely final. Haynes said something quietly to Daniel. Daniel stared at the table. I gathered my notes. Priya touched my arm briefly. Not a hug, just a touch, the kind that means you held up well and we stood. As we moved toward the door, I passed within a few feet of Daniel. He didn't look at me directly. He looked somewhere past my shoulder, the way people do when they can't decide what their face should be doing. I stopped. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I had been waiting 7 years to say something to him that I never found the right words for. And in that moment, something simple came. She knew who showed up, I said. That's all that was ever in that account. He didn't respond. I hadn't expected him to. Priya and I walked out into the corridor, which smelled like old carpet and industrial cleaner, and took the elevator down to the lobby. Outside, the Toronto sky was still gray, still unapologetic. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold air sit on my face. My phone buzzed. A message from a colleague, not about this, about something else, something I would need to return to within the hour. The work doesn't stop. It never really stops. I thought about my mother for a moment. Not the end of her life, not the hospital bed or the labored breathing or the Tuesday morning with the window open. I thought about her at her kitchen table in Sudbury, in the late afternoon, going through someone's receipts with a pencil, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, completely focused, completely competent, completely uninterested in whether anyone was watching. I thought about the note in the margin of that account form, 4 words in her neat, deliberate handwriting. For my daughter, who shows up. I put my phone in my coat pocket. I walked to where I had parked my car on a side street half a block away. I sat in the driver's seat for a minute before starting the engine, looking at nothing in particular through the windshield, just the gray street and the bare November trees and the ordinary Tuesday afternoon sounds of a city going about its business. On the dash, I had placed a small item before I left Ottawa that morning, a habit, a kind of anchor, a federal service pin, the kind you receive at certain intervals, small, understated. The sort of thing most people would never look twice at. I looked at it now. Then I started the car, and I drove.